This is Dr. Weislogel, and this is an introduction to the life and work of Javier Zubiri, very important philosopher for us and for this course, and I'm looking forward to introducing you to him and him to you. And let's get started. Zubiri was one of the big three Spanish philosophers of the 20th century. So before I talk about him, let me talk about the other big two. First was Miguel de Unamuno, born in 1864 in Bilbao, died in 1936 in Salamanca. He was a philosopher, a novelist, a poet, an essayist, a playwright, a man of letters. His most famous work is called Tragic Sense of Life, a work he said that was intended for the man of flesh and blood. Boy, that's the good stuff. Who desires to live forever, but knows he cannot. What about that? What about us and our human condition? He also wrote a book called Our Lord Don Quixote, Miguel de Cervantes' Don Quixote, such an important work in the life and thought of Spain and in Spanish language culture. He wrote Abel Sanchez and the Agony of Christianity. So Unamuno, very important, wonderful writer, very much worth checking out. And then the other important thinker was José Ortega y Gasset, born in Madrid in 1883, died there in 1955, also a philosopher and essayist. Notice he also wrote a book, Meditations on Quixote. I can't stress it enough how important that work is. He wrote a book called What is Philosophy? Some Lessons on Metaphysics, History as a System, on Historical Reason. But his most important and enduring work is a book entitled The Revolt of the Masses, which is his assessment of the person he calls Mr. Satisfied, the mass man, the culture of satisfaction and contentment without striving, without effort. Mr. Satisfied. What's life all about for them? Another fascinating work, well worth checking out. And Zubiri should be numbered among these thinkers. Unamuno was very much a literary kind of figure. Ortega y Gasset, a great writer, but also a professor, a university man. And then Zubiri is more of the technical philosopher, not so much the poet or the playwright, but the technical philosopher. So I want to tell you a little bit about his life, just a little bit to give you some familiarity. He was born in San Sebastián in Basque Country, northern Spain. San Sebastián's a great little town. They have a wonderful film festival, almost the rival of the Cannes Film Festival in France. Basque language, the Basque people are very unusual. Linguists have shown that the Basque language doesn't really have any roots in other pre-existing languages. It's a fascinating story about them, worth checking out. He started his formal education aiming towards his bachillerato, which is the equivalent, like the last 2 years of high school for us. He started out on his studies aiming towards that at age 6 with the French Marianists, who are that's a Catholic religious order. But at age 11, he entered the seminary in the Seminario de Cantabria in Comillas to become a Jesuit. So there's a Jesuit connection to the thinkers in this course. But he became homesick, and he left the seminary and he went home to finish his bachillerato, which he did at the age of 16. Now, in 1907, Pope Pius X issued an important encyclical letter called Pascendi Dominici Gregis. And what that document did for Catholics was to condemn modernism, and then, in other words, secularism or rationalism, the Enlightenment thought, and this idea that the dogma of the Catholic Church evolves or develops over time instead of being the truth yesterday and today and forever. Pope Pius X was very much against that. He thought that these modern tendencies took people away from the faith, and he condemned them. Made a list. Don't read these books. Don't follow these thinkers. But Zubiri was quite interested in modernist philosophers, especially in a flavor of philosophy called pragmatism, which is an American contribution to the history of Western thought. He considered William James, who lived between 1842 and 1910, an American, to have written the best book to ever come out of America up until that time, James's Principles of Psychology, a 2-volume work that appeared in 1890. That book really laid the foundation for the modern study of psychology. If you're a psych major, you probably at least heard this book mentioned. Zubiri's teachers tried to restrict his reading, but he reads these modernist works in secret at night. I don't know, with his flashlight or something. This produced a tension in him between the teachings of the church and the ideas that he was discovering, a kind of an internal battle of faith and reason. And so Zubiri decided to make that tension between these modernist ideas and his really deeply held Catholic faith a philosophical problem for himself, to put it in these words, to problematize the entire training he had received and to attempt a reconciliation between reason and faith. So he found within himself this problem, and he decided to devote himself to where's it coming from? How does one resolve this tension? In 1915, Zubiri graduates and then enters the Seminario Conciliar in Madrid. In 1918, having become fascinated with the ideas of Ortega y Gasset, who we just met, he leaves the seminary again to study with Ortega and also with Gabriel Garcia Morente at the Universidad Central de Madrid. He was there introduced to a kind of philosophy called phenomenology. And if you took the existentialism course with me, or anywhere, you learn that the roots of existentialist thought come from phenomenology. It's a style of philosophy, a way of philosophy that tries to observe how experience appears to us, how we experience things, without bringing in preconceived notions about how it ought to be perceived or how things are structured behind that in any kind of metaphysical way, but it's an attempt to just describe things themselves. And he was introduced to phenomenology, and it had a tremendous impact on him. From 1920 to 21, he studied at the University of Louvain in Belgium, a very important educational center there. In 1920, he received his doctorate in sacred theology from the Collegium Theologicum, the Gregorian University in Rome, a Jesuit university, still there. Great to go visit if you get a chance to get to Rome. In 1920, he also received his licence, basically a master's degree from Louvain. His thesis, which he wrote in French, was on the ideas of the founder, really, the chief leading light of phenomenology, Edmund Husserl. In 1921, just a year later, he got his PhD from the University of Madrid, and he defended a thesis on the phenomenology of judgment in Husserl's logic, the idea of judgment. Judgment in philosophy is a very important concept and quite tricky. Judgment is the idea, the action of the mind to say this is what it is, to affirm our experience and our reality. It's a difficult subject, I know full well, because I wrote my own dissertation on judgment as well, and I can't guarantee you that I have it all sorted out. On September 9th of 1921, he was ordained to the priesthood at the young age of 22. He's 22. He has 2 doctorates already. 22. What was I doing at 22? I was probably still an undergraduate at that point. In that same year, he was threatened with excommunication. That's bad. If you're a Catholic, that means you're separated off from the church. And the threat was over his own philosophical ideas. But Zubiri quickly reconciled himself. He remained, in his own way, a very faithful person his whole life. He was not looking for problems. He was not a radical in the overt sense. His philosophical ideas are quite radical. At least in the area of metaphysics, they're quite radical. It means it gets down to the roots of things. But he was not. He didn't intend himself to be a troublemaker. He wasn't trying to be Socrates in a way where he's stirring up things. So he reconciled to remain a priest and within the church. However, he found he was saying Mass rather infrequently. And when he did, he rushed it. He hurried through that. And maybe not surprisingly, that made him popular among the congregants because, I don't know what your sense is, but there are a lot of people who say, well, let's get to Mass and let's get it over with. And Zubiri, plowed through it pretty quickly and people got through. So people say, hey, let's go to his Mass. He gets it over with pretty quickly. In 1923, Ortega asked Zubiri to be an auxiliary professor at the Universidad Central, and he accepts. He is known for his philosophical depth and his difficult yet invigorating courses in the history of philosophy. So students came to his class and they found it a challenge. Strap in, put your seatbelt on. This is going to be a rough ride, but very interesting. And people attended his courses with a great deal of enthusiasm. In 1926, Zubiri won a competition to be the chair of the history of philosophy at the University of Madrid with a paper that he wrote that was critical yet respectful of pragmatism. And he started that position in 1927. Now, that's generally not how we look at how someone gets the position of chair of a philosophy department in American higher ed. It's an important job. It takes a lot of work. Ask anybody who's been a department chair. But it's a job. You apply for it and so forth. But in the Spanish situation, European generally, there were competitions where it was more of a struggle to see whether you can get those jobs. And if you got them, they were great. They were great because unlike American counterparts who are chairs of departments or chairs in philosophy, there wasn't a bunch of paperwork and forms to fill out and all that kind of stuff. The chair he had allowed him to travel and to study. It freed him up. You would think if you got a chair, either as a department chair or you got a named chair where you were just a researcher and a teacher, you one of those kind of jobs that you were hired to, there would be work and okay, maybe in the researcher part it wasn't so much the administrative things, but it would be the work of study and research and some teaching. But in the European context, you taught when you felt like it. You used that chair as your home base to pursue your studies, wherever that took you. So he did travel between 1928 and 1931. He took trips throughout Europe to study under the masters of various disciplines. He studied classical philology, that's the study of ancient languages, with Werner Jaeger, a very important a scholar of Aristotle, wrote an important book on ancient ideas of education called Paideia. He studied with Husserl, Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, and he attended some lectures of Martin Heidegger, an extremely important, maybe arguably the most important philosopher of the 20th century. Maybe the most important philosopher, certainly in German, since Immanuel Kant. And he got to attend some of his lectures and interact with Heidegger and philosophy. He studied theoretical physics with de Broglie and Schrödinger. You probably heard of Schrödinger's cat, famous experiment about quantum states and so forth. He studied biology with Spemann and Goldschmidt, mathematics with Ray Pasteur and Lavallée-Poisson and Zermelo. If you're into those fields, those are big names in those fields. And during this period, he spent 2 years in Freiburg, as I said, with Heidegger, and he translated Heidegger's 1929 lecture, What is Metaphysics, into Spanish in 1923. So whereas Heidegger is a philosophical household name, Zubiri is not. But Zubiri brought Heidegger's thought to the Spanish-speaking world, or at least he was one of the people who did that. He met with Albert Einstein, with Max Planck, with Werner Heisenberg in Berlin. Zubiri had a wide open mind. He wanted to know about everything. Melete Topan. He wanted to have concern for the whole, for everything. And in 1930, he meets the famous Spanish historian Americo Castro. Okay, he's interested in history besides all those other fields. But most importantly, Professor Castro had a daughter, Carmen, and Javier was smitten. So Javier met Carmen. They fell in love, and that's a problem because, as you might recall, Zubiri has been ordained a priest as well as a professor. So he in 33 he returns to Madrid. He requests to leave the priesthood. He even went to the Vatican to meet personally with Pope Pius XI, and he couched his request in terms of some philosophical differences. Look, I don't think I should be a priest because I'm not sure that I could be all in with some of these ideas. Okay, so the Pope listened, and in 1934 he was released from the priesthood, but he was ordered to remain a celibate. Okay, you don't have to be a priest, but you have to live like one. In 1936, though, Zubiri makes another request look, let me out of this whole thing. I want to be removed from holy orders altogether. It has to do with Carmen. And he was released from his clerical vows, but he was required to resign his professorship and to leave Madrid so as not to cause scandal. I mean, these are the old days. You didn't just, this is before Vatican II, you didn't just ask to be let go and you were let go. There wasn't divorce and there wasn't leaving the priesthood. Those were different times, and it would have been scandalous. So he did. From 1940 to 42, he occupied the chair in philosophy at the Universidad de Barcelona, and he didn't like it very much. Now, he basically said that within academia, within the structures of academic philosophy in Spain, it was almost like he couldn't breathe. He didn't feel like he could pursue the lines of thought, to think the way he wanted to think within those confines. Now, you have to imagine what it would be like to walk away from that. That's a momentous decision because you have it made. You got a good paycheck, and you got a place to work, and your libraries, and you could travel, and you got funding, and I mean it's fantastic. You won the prize, and he leaves. He leaves for what I would say is reasons of integrity. He just didn't think he could be the kind of philosopher he wanted to be. So he leaves, and he starts his cursos. They've come to be known as courses or private seminars in his apartment. I mean, think about that. He's, we these days, we go to school. Yeah, we come to learn. I'm not cynical. I think we come to learn. But listen, what we really want is a credential. What we really want is certification. What we really want is that diploma, that piece of paper that says that we did learn. You could learn all you want, but what you want is somebody to verify that you learn. But Zubiri was able to attract people to come and study philosophy with him at his place. Now, as it turns out, later those cursos were considered adequate for getting credit at a couple of Madrid universities. So basically, he didn't teach at the university, but if you took the cursos with him, you eventually could get what you and I would call the credit for that. So they were highly respected, and people would come from really all over Spain, which is not a giant-sized country, but they would come in once a week to interact with Zubiri and to think along with him. He was very influential thinker. So you'll see a picture down there in the screen of a bunch of books. That's from my shelf right behind me here, and most of the books that were published under Zubiri's name were notes from these cursos, notes from the cursos. We use the word lecture. I say the word lecture, but I rarely lecture in the original sense of that word. Lecture in French means to read. And what the high-powered European professors would always do is write out in great detail their ideas. And you would go to class and they would stand in the front at the lectern where you stand to read, and they would read. They would read their papers, and I would stop and they would gloss, make comments as they were reading. But the lectures were written out. So a lot of this material existed, and it wasn't published during his lifetime. It was published posthumously. Very little, in fact, by Zubiri was published in his lifetime. But thank goodness we have all this material, because there's some wonderful stuff there. Only some of it's been translated so far into English, but there's a great deal of it, and more keeps coming out. He in 1963 he published a really important book, but prior to that, 1944, he put out a series of essays translated, the title as Nature, History, and God. In 46, he traveled to the U.S., where Carmen's father was teaching at Wisconsin and Texas and even at Princeton. And Zubiri gave a lecture at Princeton, but he gave it in French because his English wasn't very good. Between 1944 and 1962, though, he published exactly one 2-page essay. One. I published more than that in that period of time. If you did that today, you wouldn't get tenure. I mean, there's no way that would work out. But he wasn't looking for tenure. He wasn't looking for any validation from academia. He wanted to do his own thing, so he published a 2-page essay. And despite that, in 1953, a journal called Alcalá published homage to Javier Zubiri, celebrating 25 years of his being a professor, sort of. 25 years of his philosophical influence was celebrated, even though he didn't publish a lot. So all of that is on the force of his cursos, that in-person teaching, tutoring, thinking alongside together with him was so very influential. And a number of the people who did do this with him didn't go on to be professional philosophers, but they went on to be leaders of Spanish society, bankers and government people and doctors and so forth, and they made good money, and they helped the Zubiris out financially, so they were able to, he was able to continue his work. But in 1961, I'll just mention this now, he meets Ignacio Ellacuría. I have a lot more to say about that, but you've already read some of Ellacuría, so that's the year he meets him. And in 62, he published Sobre la Esencia. In 1963, that gets translated into On Essence. Also in 63, he comes out with a book called 5 Lessons of Philosophy, and between 64 and 76, he just keeps giving these lectures. But between 81 and 83, give or take, 1980, 1981, 83, he publishes a big book called Sentient Intelligence. He publishes it in 3 volumes. The first volume is called Intelligence and Reality. The second is called Intelligence and Logos. And the third is called Intelligence and Reason. And we will get a mini lesson on the teaching of that giant-sized set of books as we go along in the course. But many of his works, mainly from his cursos, were published after he died. In 1982, King Juan Carlos I, who's having his issues, presents Zubiri with the Premio Nacional de Investigación Santiago Ramón y Cajal. That's a big prize, a big notoriety, a very respectable recognition of his work. Zubiri died of intestinal cancer in 1983 in Madrid, and he was working on this book, Man and God, at the time of his death. So the book that we're going to study, at least parts of it that we're going to study to get the background we need for Ellacuría and Dussel and Philosophy of Liberation, was published in 1985. And there's a picture of the desk in his apartment, a big apartment with his library there, and the materials that he was using to work on this book, Man and God, are still really to be found on his desk. The people who were very close to Zubiri really respected him, really put him up on a pedestal, and so they've tried to preserve his home here in a way such that they can continue to work there. And in fact, in 1989, to promote his legacy, they was founded the Javier Zubiri Foundation. There's a satellite of that based out of Washington, D.C. here as well. And each week there are still cursos, not held by Zubiri anymore, alas, but still cursos in reference to his work held right here in his apartment still. There's a picture of me in earlier days in the middle between Antonio Gonzalez and Diego Gracia, two very important Spanish philosophers. I may have some more to say about them, but they are part of the leadership of the Javier Zubiri Foundation, and they themselves are prolific thinkers and publishers, and I was honored to be able to meet with them. So why should we study Zubiri? Well, he's a profound philosopher, and as I stated before, the reason few of us know about him compared to, say, Martin Heidegger or Ludwig Wittgenstein is because he wrote in Spanish, and there's I'm not afraid to say, a prejudice there. But his work is very, very important. He was trained by the Jesuits, and we're at a Jesuit institution, so we can honor our own tradition, I suppose you could say. And he influenced, and I say somehow, and that's one of my questions, he influenced liberation theology. As I might have said before, Zubiri was very interested in metaphysics, the philosophy of the basic nature structure of reality. I might even call him the philosopher of reality. And when you read his works, you're not going to hear too much about ethics coming through. You're not going to hear too much about politics coming through. I'm not saying he wasn't interested, but that's not what he did. That was not where his philosophical pursuits took him. And yet, those kind of, you might call ethereal philosophical pursuits influenced people who did take it in the direction of social justice and ethics and liberatory politics. And I want to try to figure out how we got from there to there. That's what I want to know about. Particularly his student and then colleague, Ignacio Ellacuría. He's important for us because he ended up studying with Zubiri more or less 18 years. That's almost as long as Aristotle famously studied with Plato. So Ellacuría knows his work. In fact, Ellacuría is the person who completed Man and God. He was the editor of that. It wasn't finished at the time of Zubiri's passing, and it was because Ellacuría put it together and finished it. And Ellacuría devoted himself to university education, and that's where we find ourselves. And he devoted himself to the overcoming of oppression, and we certainly can look around our society and realize that there's a call maybe to us to do the same. And as we know, we'll say more about, he was martyred at the UCA, the University of Central America, Simeon Cañas, on November 16th, 1989, along with his colleagues and his housekeeper and his housekeeper's daughter. We'll say more. What's going to be our strategy for studying Man and God? Well, we're going to try to state the main problems Zubiri addresses clearly, so we could figure out what he's after, what he's up to. We want to try to list and describe the puzzle pieces, let's call them, that are required to try to get to some solution to those problems that Zubiri's interested in. He needed some pieces to try to put them together. And then we want to try to compare some of those key pieces that he found to the ideas and concepts found in other, more well-known philosophers, some that you may be well familiar with. And then, let's try to see how Zubiri put those pieces together and what his solutions to his problems really look like. And then note which of those solutions had that influence on the more political, socially engaged thinkers like Ellacuría and Enrique Dussel. Now, some advice before we get going. I'm not going to sugarcoat this for you. Zubiri's work is challenging. It's difficult. I think it's difficult not because he's unclear. I believe Zubiri is very clear. It's almost because of his efforts to be clear that his work is difficult. It's demanding. It's painstaking as it steps through the problems that he's trying to solve. It's painstaking. It's going to take some effort to hang with him. So we need to be patient. We need to be patient with ourselves. We need to recognize that we're not going to be able to just pick up this book and figure it all out. I will share with you a story about how I came to know Zubiri. I found him very serendipitously. I was in San Francisco with my wife just for fun, and my wife and I love books, and we can't walk past a bookstore without going in. And when I go to a bookstore, I go right to the philosophy section. And I've been doing this for a long time, and really I'm rarely surprised. It's not like I own all the books that I could find in a bookstore, but I know who the authors are. I've heard of them. I know the titles of their books. I know something about them. I like to think I'm pretty well informed, and so I'm just looking around. Maybe there's a nice edition of something that I want or whatever. And one day in this bookstore in San Francisco, I see a book called On Essence by Javier with an X Zubiri. And I never heard of him at that point. It was a nice looking book. It was a blue cloth book, the cloth that has that kind of almost leathery feel to it. And I like a nice book, and I pulled it off the shelf, and I don't know who this guy is. I never heard of this book before, which really surprised me because I feel like I know a lot of these things. And I open up the book to a random page and I start reading. And I'm reading, and my wife comes over and says, "Hey, listen, we got dinner plans. We got to get out of here. Let's get back to the hotel and clean up and go out. We got to go to the restaurant. We have a reservation." I said, "Okay," and I shut the book and I thought to myself, I have no idea what I just read. I don't understand it. I don't understand. I didn't start on page 1. I admit I opened it up, but I didn't get it. I didn't feel the rhythm of it. I didn't feel what the problem was. And I was stymied by what I had read. So of course I had to buy it. I absolutely had to buy it. So I buy the book and I put it in my suitcase to take home eventually. And when I get home, I actually throw it on a pile with all the other books that I buy, but might not exactly have time to read right now. And there it sat for a long time. And long story short, circumstance in my life changed, and I got into an organization that put on programs to foster discussion about issues in science and religion. And one thing leads to another, and I end up in Spain with some people who are interested in these projects, and they say, "Hey, do you know this Zubiri Foundation?" I go, "Well, I think I have a book by that guy." So one thing led to another, and I find this guy, and in the intervening years, been a good number of years now, I got those books back out. I got some other books. I read them, and I got it. In fact, I would have to say for myself, along with maybe one or two other very important philosophers that you've heard of in the history of philosophy, Zubiri has been one of the biggest influences on my way of thinking. Not to say I agree with everything, but a big influence on my thinking. And it was just, it's kind of random. It seemed like kind of serendipitous. Patience, right? If I just read it and go, "I don't know what this is," and threw it away, I would have missed one of the most important philosophical influences, as it turned out, in my life if I was not patient. So I counsel patience. You have to read charitably. When you read something that doesn't sound like it makes sense, you have to respect who it's coming from. It doesn't mean because somebody famous or respected says something that what they say is correct. What it does suggest is that if they are well known and well respected, then if they're saying something that doesn't seem exactly right to us, maybe we should give them the benefit of the doubt and say, "Well, listen, they're probably not crazy, so maybe I'm missing something. Maybe they're looking at something in a way I'm not. Maybe I'm misunderstanding exactly what they're saying here." I'll give you a great example. Aristotle's book, The Nicomachean Ethics, is on happiness. And if you never read the book and somebody were to say to you, "Well, who are the happiest people on earth and where can you find them?" You would probably say, "Kids at Disney. Kids, look at them. They're laughing and running around. They don't have a care in the world. Look how happy they are. Aristotle says, I'll tell you, the one group of people who absolutely are not happy and cannot be happy are children. Now, the first time you read that, you think, did he not have eyes? Did he not see kids running around ancient Athens having a good time? Is he crazy? Right? And if you say that, you toss the book away, you're going to be missing a fantastic book, The Nicomachean Ethics, that could be, as it was for me, another one of those life-changing books. He meant something different, and you'll have to read it for yourself to see what he meant. So you got to be charitable. You got to say, all right, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. What are you trying to say? Now, once you do understand what the philosopher says, then you're certainly free, if you have good reasons, to disagree with that philosopher. They're never right just because they're famous. Don't think that. I'm just saying, if it might be worth your effort to let them have their say the way they want to, so you can understand what it is if you end up being critical of it, or understand what they say and go, yeah, you know what, now that I understand, I'm actually persuaded by that. And following with that, be critical, right? That is the point. Don't just, once you understand something, don't think to yourself, oh, well, now that I understand it, that must mean it's right. No, it is very possible to understand something and disagree with it. And it's important to be able to say why. Important for yourself, so that you not just think things in your head, but you know what it is that you think and why you think it. That's very important. But it also could be very helpful for the person who's wrong. If you are able to at least give it your best shot to say, you know, what your views here, I've understood them. I've asked you for clarification. You've given it to me at the best I can. I believe I understand you, but it's not, I don't think what you're saying is correct. Here's what I find to be lacking in the view that you have. That actually might help somebody else get better ideas. So being critical is a way of being charitable. It's not a way of being just, argumentative. It's a way of being charitable to somebody and to yourself, giving yourself and others the best chance to find the truth, as far as that's possible for us human beings. Now, the problems to be addressed in this book are, what is reality? We all know the word. We've all heard it, but that's what philosophy is all about. When you say, what's that word mean? You go, hey, wait a minute, don't make me say, because I'm not sure I can put into words. Well, let's try to figure out what Zubiri means by reality. What is his philosophical anthropology? That's what this course we're taking. That's an effort in philosophical anthropology, trying to say what a human being is. So we'll see Zubiri's view of that, and that will be important for Kriya and Dussel. And then, what is God? I mean, again, there's a word, but what do we mean when we use that word? It's maybe not so obvious. And then pull that all together. What's the relationship between the human being, God, and reality? That's the rich problematic that Zubiri is working in, and that will work in this course.